seminar for Montgomery County Right to Life a few years back, and I've heard such wonderful things about it. So for tonight, he's going to condense that, I'm sure, to as much information as we can pack into our brains for the night. But thanks for coming out. This is a great opportunity to be educated, so that we can speak in a way that is well informed on this topic. So he's going to be talking about, his expertise is not only history, he's professor of history at HBU, particularly for our benefit tonight, he's going to talk about the history of the unborn and is the pro-life movement revolutionary. So, Dr. Joseph. Is it working?
It's a nice little light. Well, I want to thank Camille Harris for her invitation to speak to you tonight. Yeah, I had to look at old emails to determine what year it was that I gave that seminar. It was 2015. I think it was January 2015 that I came up on a Saturday afternoon and gave a series of talks to a group of I think everyone was a member of Montgomery County Right to Life. I mean, I think pretty much everyone was there. But it was a really good group and a really good experience. It was a seminar on the history of the unborn child. And I just sort of went through things chronologically. Today, I'm not going to do that exactly. But in any case, I'm very happy to be with you tonight to sketch more briefly some of my thoughts about the history of the unborn in America. The four-session thing I did sort of started with the ancient Greeks and Romans, and we worked our way toward America, but I'm going to start with America tonight. And my theme is a question, is the pro-life movement revolutionary? And here, revolutionary, I don't mean, you know, violent revolution, but is it a movement that's trying to bring about a dramatic change in American culture? But let me expand the question a little bit, excuse me, for greater clarity, and ask, is the pro-life movement restorative or revolutionary? Yeah. That is, are we trying to restore America to a tradition, to an earlier golden age, as it were, in which the unborn were granted full human status and full rights under law? Excuse me. Or are we trying to forge a revolutionary new understanding of the humanity of the unborn, an understanding that was not characteristic of the American past? This, to me, is an important question. How we understand our own cause affects how we promote it and how we understand those who resist it. And obviously, my question involves history. We can't know whether a movement is revolutionary or not without comparing it to the past, you know, what has come before. So tonight I want to point to the history of the unborn child in America. And the conclusion I reach is, I'm going to tell you right now, sometimes students, when they write their essays, like to not state their main point at the beginning of the essay. And I have to tell them, you're not writing a mystery novel. You know, it's not a whodunit where you only reveal the criminal at the end. So I'm gonna follow my own advice and give you my conclusion. And my conclusion is that the pro-life movement of today is attempting to complete a task that was actually begun about 200 years ago, primarily by American physicians. The task of persuading the American people of the full humanity of the unborn from conception forward. It was a difficult task for those physicians. Their project, I do argue, really was revolutionary. It was introducing a significant change. They appeared to have succeeded by about 1900, but then their work came undone in the 20th century. From this point of view, the modern pro-life movement is partly restorative. It's trying to restore the good accomplished in the 19th century. But I think it's also partly revolutionary, both because it continues something that was revolutionary when that work began, and because the work was not completed. You know, so I feel like we're kind of joining something that was promoting a change back in the 1800s, the change was rolled back, but it had never been complete. And so now we're sort of doing something that we're restoring what was achieved, but we're also moving it forward. So that's my basic idea. To say that physicians in the 1800s undertook a revolutionary work might at first seem strange in light of much of American history. For a lot of our history, children have been seen as a great blessing. And I want to talk a little bit about, okay, so we're still, okay, but talk a little bit about colonial America. In colonial times, the 1600s, most of the 1700s, before the Revolution, the American Revolution, American families were the largest they had ever been. Colonial women had on average at least 7 children over the course of their lifetime. A married woman might bear a child every 1.5 to 2 years, and her childbearing could continue into her early 40s. Children were definitely seen as a blessing. Colonial Americans were an agricultural people. They idealized both the harvest and the birth of children as part of, in the phrase of historian Susan Klepp, a single vision of welcome abundance. A woman's fertility was often described in terms associated with agriculture. A pregnant woman might be called teeming or fruitful or flourishing. Fertility was seen as a natural process that was to be allowed to bear its natural fruit. In bearing children, the colonial woman enhanced the wealth of the family, secured the family's future, and lifted the social standing of her husband. So pregnancy and the unborn child were viewed through this lens of hoped for abundance, right? The unborn is a sign of things to come and is valued and regarded as a blessing from that vantage point. In fact, this hoped for abundance made up for a lot of these almost overwhelming uncertainties that a woman felt about her pregnancy and the developing life within her. She had little, if any, firm knowledge of fetal development. In the early months of pregnancy, she could not even be sure she was actually pregnant with a living child. The womb was thought to produce growth that mimicked a fetus. The experience of quickening, the time in pregnancy, perhaps at about 4 months gestation, when the woman first felt the fetus move, that did provide some clarity, because at that point a woman could be sure that she was pregnant with a living child and not something else. Until successful delivery, though, the dangers of childbirth for both mother and child continued to envelop the unborn, and this doubt and uncertainty. I kind of see the unborn child in the colonial period as kind of like a dim, distant light that's only gradually coming into view. And when that light does come into view, birth, there's happiness. But at that point, it didn't seem so important to try to define what that light had been before it arrived, right? So you're just looking at the outcome, and there's not a whole lot of knowledge about, the 9 months that lead to that point. The light arrives, it's desired, it's seen, it's loved, and it's declared good. So it's a very positive view of the unborn as this source of a hoped-for abundance in the family life. And even, I would say, even as the beloved unknown, child is coming, you have hopeful expectation. But that view did not really persist to the same degree into the 1800s. There's something called the demographic transition. It's a very dry term for the decline in fertility rates in America among American women that begins really in the late 1700s in some parts of the country, but eventually over the course of the 1800s spreads everywhere. In 1800, the average American woman had 7 children. By 1900, that rate had fallen to 3.5. So this is the demographic transition. And in this transition, the ideal of the colonial family kind of began to give way. Children began to be valued less as additions to family wealth, more as objects of parental affection, even as tokens of love between the husband and wife. But the old association of human fertility with agricultural abundance, with this openness to nature and sort of allowing nature to operate unimpeded, that diminishes. And in fact, in some quarters, large families were beginning to be seen as signs of poverty rather than as signs of blessing. So many people tell me, this has never happened to me. I mean, I have 3 children. Maybe that's just, I don't make the cut in the typical grocery store. But, families that have more children tell me that they get scowls and scorn sometimes. People tell them nasty things as they move through the aisles with their 2, 3, 4, 5 children. I don't know. So where does that thinking begin? You don't really see much of that in colonial America, but you start seeing it in the 1800s. Signs of large families seen as a sign of poverty rather than blessing. And American women, and probably their husbands as well, began to view their fertility as something that ought to be consciously, rationally controlled. Nature would no longer be allowed to bat last in everything. And both artificial and natural methods of birth control were explored. And I'm not going to talk about those, but in this new setting, I think a new understanding of the unborn child would be necessary to secure the child's position in the human family. A view that would not depend on deference to natural processes or an ideal of family abundance, but on an understanding of the unborn child in and of himself, in and of herself. And that's what I think you don't have in the colonial period. And it's partly the result of just, a scientific issue, right? The lack of scientific understanding of what actually the unborn is at the different stages of gestation. But when you remove those other positive elements from the colonial period, there needed to be something to replace them, right? In order to give the child that position in the human family. So, and I'm going to talk about the physicians in a second as the source for that new understanding. But let me just say a little bit about the change, the demographic transition and the changes of the 19th century. This different way of understanding childbearing is evident not just in declining fertility rates. By the mid-1800s, many American physicians were reporting an alarming increase in the number of abortions. Some of them estimated abortion rates as high as the rate is today in the United States. I think that they were mistaken. I think they overestimated it because there was really no method of abortion in the 1800s that was both safe to the mother and deadly to the fetus. A lot of herbal treatments were reputed to be abortifacient, but the high dosages at which they would effect an abortion were also harmful or even deadly to the mother. Low dosages of those treatments, on the other hand, that might be safe for the mother, were ineffective in expelling the fetus. So the only other possibility was surgical abortions, but surgical abortions were extremely dangerous, and they couldn't have been performed often without, killing a lot of women. And fortunately, the historical record doesn't reveal that large numbers of American women were dying from surgical abortions. So in short, 19th century abortion was too dangerous or too ineffective to have been commonly resorted to as it is today. But I think it is likely, and I lean a lot on the testimony of these physicians, that there was kind of an increase in the number of American women who were attempting abortions, whether they actually succeeded in effecting the abortion or not. With women not always sure whether they were even pregnant, they might try something and then end up not delivering a child, and they might actually believe that they had succeeded in carrying out an abortion when in fact they had never been pregnant. Why would a woman attempt an abortion in the 1800s? According to what observers said at the time, poverty, to cover up sexual misconduct, to avoid the burdens of pregnancy and childbearing, the lack of a sense of duty to bear children, the absence of a teaching that children were a divine blessing, the desire to prolong the romance that had led to the marriage, fear of the dangers of childbirth, the desire to eliminate pregnancies resulting from prostitution, all of these things. Certainly the widespread belief that the unborn didn't really come alive as human beings until quickening was a factor. Many women appear to believe that moral responsibility for the child began at quickening, when one could finally be sure that one was carrying a living human child. And you know, when I first started studying this, I just found it hard to believe. And maybe that's what you're thinking as you're sitting, and you can tell me that when we get to the question and answer section, but I just found it hard to believe that that's how it was looked at. And it's still possible that I've just overstated it, you know, but there's just so much historical evidence coming from different angles to suggest that this was kind of the situation, right? There was just very little knowledge about fetal development. Even the idea of life, you know, the difference between something living and non-living is not then what it is now. Cellular theory, all these things. So, you know, it all sort of comes together, and I think this is sort of the picture we have of what's going on in the 1800s. So it was a morally confused situation. Oh, we got it?
Let's see. Where's the...
I got the doohickey
Oh, you
here.
have it. See if you can turn on.
Well, the slide, oh,
Yeah.
that might help. Yeah, let's see. The slideshow has to be started,
Okay.
and I don't know how to start it from the clicker.
Yeah.
Let's see.
You have the stick from the presenter in here?
It's in there, yeah. Do you know how to
And
start?
is it on?
Wonders of technology.
Yeah.
It started updating, right? When you were gonna... There we go.
If you could start the slideshow, sometimes that helps. Start it from the laptop.
Am I doing this or are you doing it?
You're doing that.
Okay, good.
Oh,
So that's
okay.
working
Okay.
now. Okay.
There you go. Way to go, Teresa.
Let me see if I can. Yeah, that's the setting. There we go. So yeah, there's a picture of a colonial family. You know, lots of kids. You know, there's a theory that Susan Klepp, the historian I mentioned a moment ago, has looked at some colonial art, portraits of women, and found that you know, a lot of them have women holding baskets of fruit in their laps. And she argues that this was meant to represent the fertility of the woman, right? This connection between agricultural abundance and human fertility. And so you can see, this is from other examples. I mean, Copley is one of the top artists in England and America in the 18th century. So there's the fruit. There's the chart of the demographic transition. You can see 1807 and then declining all the way into the early 1900s. And then you have the baby boom, part of which is shown on this chart. And this is another one. It's a little more sharp. Yeah, so that baby boom in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s is sort of reverses a trend that had been going on for more than a century of declining fertility.
You can go over here if you want to, and you can click.
I'm sorry?
You can go over here and click, and I can get you to them together.
Oh, you want me to move?
Yeah, over here, since you're not using the mic. If you can.
Okay. Well, can I move the podium?
Sure.
Is the podium portable?
Sure.
There's a wire coming out of...
Just do your thing. Improvise. There you go.
Okay. Am I in a good position for you?
Good. Yeah, I can adjust.
Okay. So yeah, so this chart goes from 1970 to 2007. You can see that baby boom is an anomaly in the history up to that point. So it's, from our vantage point, it's a morally confused situation. And I think there were really three groups of Americans at the time in a position to exert moral leadership over questions of unborn life. The Christian clergy, the physicians, and lawmakers, legislators, judges, lawyers, people from the field of law. I want to say a little bit about the clergy, because actually they're not going to take a central role in this story in the 1800s. That doesn't mean Christianity wasn't a powerful influence in American culture in the 1800s. Here's some stats that make that point about the influence of Christianity. At least 2/3 of Americans participated in the activities of a local church community in the 1800s. At least 3 times as many Americans attended church on Sunday as voted in presidential elections. This is interesting. This is mid-century, mid-1800s. Every year, Americans heard 3 times as many sermons as they received pieces of mail. The total annual income of American churches and religious associations nearly equaled the total annual revenues of the federal government. Nearly all of the nation's 400 colleges were run by religious institutions. And virtually the only kind of graduate studies one could pursue after a bachelor's degree would be in theology or in the study of Scripture. And in leadership over this vast cultural force were the Christian clergy, the Christian ministers, who were twice as numerous as soldiers in the U.S. Army. You know, that's my last comparison, right? So we got more ministers than soldiers. In the 1800s, American Christianity was overwhelmingly Protestant Christianity. More than 95% of the country's churches were Protestant churches. So nearly all of the clergy were Protestant clergy. For much of the 1800s, the clergy did not address the status of the unborn child or the morality of abortion. And this was another surprise for me. And I want to give you an example. Charles Hodge on the right, maybe some of you have heard of him. He was a Presbyterian theologian from the mid-1800s. One of the most famous theologians of the era, of the century, really all of American religious history. He was once asked by his brother, Hugh Hodge, a physician, about the beginnings of human life. Charles Hodge speculated that perhaps human life begins at conception, as a plant was a plant from the moment its seed began to sprout. But Charles was not able to say anything further. "I fear I can give you little assistance," he told his brother. "You are beyond my depth. I do not know of any speculation on the subject. I suspect we all know just nothing. If I can hear of anything on this subject, I will let you know." Charles Hodge published a major work of theology in the 1870s, and in that he did not discuss the beginning of human life in the womb. He did address each of the 10 Commandments, which is something that's typically done in these works of theology. And in his treatment of the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," he discussed homicide, suicide, dueling, war, killing in self-defense, and capital punishment, but not abortion. And this is a kind of a characteristic silence of the clergy for much of the 19th century. It's not that they were pro-choice or pro-abortion. You know, we really couldn't put any kind of tag like that on them. But rather that they did not have a well-articulated view of the unborn and of the question of the morality of abortion. By 1900, some Protestants had begun to affirm the humanity of the unborn and the wrongness of abortion. Let's see, I don't have this guy's picture up, but William Shedd described abortion as murder in his 3-volume Dogmatic Theology, published from 1888 to 1894. So right there at the tail end of the 1800s, you have a Presbyterian theologian addressing the issue. But even so, it just looks like they were just beginning to articulate a view of the unborn, and there's some signs of inhibitions among clergy to discuss it. A minister in Michigan in 1880 acknowledged the wrongness of abortion, but argued, quote, "There are obvious reasons why the pulpit should not always be used to denounce crimes of this nature. To do it continually would be to turn the pulpit and church into a place that many people would not like to visit." So, and maybe that's probably familiar to a lot of us. You know, the concern that if you speak about something controversial, You'll turn people away and you'll end up in a worse position pastorally than you were before you spoke. So that's a little bit about the clergy. I'm not sure why it was thus. My current theory, and it's only a theory, is that something is lost in transmission of the Christian tradition, at least about the morality of abortion, in the settling and developing of America and the United States. Some pieces are lost at sea, as it were. There's no question that in the Christian tradition, abortion was always considered a serious moral wrong. The knowledge of fetal development was not present the way it is today, but that moral principle was always there. But it's perhaps because the American clergy just didn't think it was an issue. They didn't sort of develop thinking about it. They didn't address it very, very often. And in fact, it's not the clergy, but the physicians who are the ones who are interested in these questions and who do the work of spreading a new science of the unborn, a new embryology that had really begun to develop in the 1600s and radically changed the scientific and philosophical understanding of the unborn that had prevailed for centuries before. For centuries, going back to ancient times, the unborn were thought to pass through a series of developmental stages that culminated in full humanness, but did not begin in full humanness. This was the theory of delayed ensoulment, that the human soul entered the body not at conception, but at some later point in gestation. Aristotle was taken to believe that the soul entered male embryos at 40 days and female embryos at 80 days gestation. I don't try to explain that difference. I mean, he claimed it was based on empirical research, you know.
Is that why they live longer?
They get a later start, but they live at least 40 days longer. So this is a theory that's widely held from ancient times forward, and the exact point of ensoulment might vary from that 40-day standard. But there's always an idea in the West that there is a delay. But this begins to be seriously challenged in the 1600s. Thomas Fiennes was a Belgian physician, and in 1620 he theorized that, hey, wait, maybe the soul just enters within a few days of conception. You know, why do we actually believe that it comes in later? Legal writers began to incorporate such thinking into their treatises. Paulus Zacchaeus, on the right there, wrote a 9-volume work called Medical Legal Questions about legal questions arising from medical practice. So 9 volumes of this. Volume 1 was published in 1621. There, Zacchaeus supported the traditional theory of delayed ensoulment. But in Volume 9, published in 1650, some 30 years later, he argued for ensoulment at conception. So for him, you can just see it in one single author, that transition, that crossover. It was a couple of decades after that the Dutch scientist Leeuwenhoek discovered human sperm, and they go back. He didn't really understand what he was looking at under his microscope, but his discovery, combined with cell theory, suggested that living organisms had very small microscopic beginnings. No one was sure how the embryo first formed in the womb. The egg would not be discovered until 1826, and knowledge of fertilization came even later than that. But by 1800, educated physicians held that the embryo was fully human from the moment of conception. And in this view, quickening was simply